road to hell is sometimes paved with good intention, how great the injustice and tragedy when the road to freedom, tempered by selfless courage and good intention in the struggle against evil and oppression, is forged through the gates of hell. Between 1961 and 1989, 132 political prisoners were executed by hanging at Pretoria Central Gallows. Many were young. Solomon Mahlangu, executed in 1979, was 22 years old when hanged. All save one were black. John Harris, hanged at age 27 on the 1st of April 1965, was the only white person to be executed for fighting apartheid.
On Wednesday morning, the day before the execution, I saw John for 90 minutes. I was with him again for 2 hours in the afternoon. I took our son David just to see him. He played happily with the screen and crawled around on the prison floor. How can I describe the moment when the last visit was up and it was time to leave?
John Harris, the final spear carrier of the African resistance movement, died alone. The rest of us, I suppose, were lucky in that we survived.
And we vigiled the night he was executed, and it was just terrible to leave Johannesburg. As John's father said it, we all left Johannesburg while he was alive in order to attend his funeral next day. And we vigiled with Father McGuinness that night. And then in the morning he said a prayer and he went off to John's execution.
He always said he was an atheist, of course. But Father McGuinness and he were very good friends. Father McGuinness walked with him to his execution.
It was horrible. You know, we all hated the death penalty as it was. But to have your friend executed was pretty awful.
Looking back, it was an absolute revelation as to how the attachment to John was. I don't know whether there's, is there a special relationship between a son and a mother? Who knows? But as I say, my mother committed suicide.
Executed on the 1st of April 1965 at age 27 on death row, John Harris had one final request, that one day in a new and free South Africa, on his tombstone should be written, John Harris, True Patriot. The massacre at Sharpeville climaxed a decade of violent response by the South African government to non-violent opposition to apartheid. Responding to a nationwide call by founding president of the Pan-Africanist Congress, Robert Sobukwe, black South Africans, deliberately leaving their passbooks at home, walked to the nearest police station, submitting themselves for arrest. Deputy editor of the Rand Daily Mail, Benjamin Pogrund, was with protesters that assembled outside the Sharpeville police station.
And we got into this crowd. The police evidence afterwards of this threatening crowd, it just wasn't true, because I was in the thick of that crowd. And once they knew us on the Rand Daily Mail, all that people wanted to do was to tell me their grievances, and suddenly the shots began.
At Sharpeville, police opened fire and systematically mowed down the assembled crowd of unarmed protesters.
They started shooting. Then after a few seconds, I saw somebody bleeding. I thought, no, man, these people are using live ammunition. I started running. It was just about five meters. Then I was shot on my left thigh.
69 people were killed, the majority shot in the back, attempting to flee the onslaught. Some 180 were injured. It was clear and final confirmation that non-violent opposition had failed. It was finally a declaration of war.
Ernie was the attorney who found the evidence for the Sharpeville inquiry. But what happened was Father Leo Ricali, he phoned Ernie, and he said a lot of these people had been shot in the back. And so the priests smuggled Ernie through a back window of Baragwanath Hospital, and he took statements from the people who'd been wounded. And that's how the Sharpeville inquiry began.
Declaring a state of emergency, on the 30th of March 1960, the government banned the ANC, PAC and the South African Communist Party. Thousands of activists were detained and imprisoned. Many others fled into exile. Among those detained were several members of the non-racial Liberal Party of South Africa.
When Ernie was detained after Sharpeville, when they just rounded up everybody they could find, and they all spent 3 months in prison.
On release, unbeknown to the party leadership, a number of members secretly formed an underground sabotage movement, which they called the National Liberation Committee, NLC, later named the African Resistance Movement, or ARM. Members of ARM were predominantly white, mostly academics, student activists, and journalists. Their focus was strategic sabotage of key installations, strictly avoiding injury and loss of life.
They kept reprimanding other people like us who weren't in it. But Ernie always said, you start with pylons, you'll end up with people.
Banned. In 1961, the PAC launched its armed wing, POCO, and engaged in sabotage and violent armed rebellion, which led to the murder of white civilians and black government and homeland officials. And so the hangings began, at times more than one at a time. On the 9th of May 1963, 6 POCO cadres were hanged together. On the 1st of November, a group of 3. By 1963, 80 political trials of 1,105 people had taken place, with 40 convicted and hanged and 6 sentenced to life. On the 16th of December 1961, with a series of sabotage explosions, the ANC launched its underground armed wing, Umkhonto Wesizwe. 8 months later, on the 5th of August 1962, Nelson Mandela was arrested and incarcerated. On the 21st of March 1960, as the shots fired at the Sharpeville massacre echoed around the world, John and Anne Harris were in London, with John having graduated from the University of the Witwatersrand on a scholarship at Oxford.
I met John when I was 16. I was a matric student at a convent. He was 17 and working. He was studying for an engineering degree at Wits, but had decided that he wanted to teach and was waiting until he could go back and study for a teaching degree. I hadn't been out with many boys, and those I met at church socials bored me. But John was different. He was interested in books, and so was I, and we talked books the whole time, the first day we met. We spent much of our time together, but we couldn't go out at night or to parties because my parents were antagonistic towards John. They were religious, and he was an atheist. In April 1959, we were married. I turned 21 3 days before our wedding. In 1960, John and I went to England, and he began studying at Oxford. We had saved enough for this, and I took a job to provide for our living expenses. We could have stayed in England, but we wanted to come back to South Africa. John felt very strongly about the political situation in South Africa, and he wanted to take an active part and try to change things. Within the first week of our return, John became active in the Liberal Party. By 1962, he was serving on the Executive and National Committee of the Liberal Party.
He was an organiser's heaven on wheels, John Harris, because he was prepared to do almost anything you asked him, and he always landed up doing all the dirty work, the really hard stuff. We never had any money for transport or anything. People just had to get in their cars and go when things had to be done. But he was terribly generous with his petrol money and his time, and was prepared to go all over the place. I remember one day, one of our members had a child in the Transkei and had been unable to pay the school fees of the school there. And the parents and the school had just kept the child at the school in the holidays, wouldn't release her and held her hostage. And it was in the middle of his sister's 21st birthday, I think. He just got in his, what did he have, a car, a combi, just drove to the Transkei and got out. That was John.
Anne and John were overseas. They were in Oxford. And Anne was working, and she became pregnant. And they had to come back because, of course, John could not complete his degree because they didn't have any financial assistance. And I remember meeting them at the airport, and my first feeling was how very pale they were. Having lived in England, they were very, very pale. Anyway, so Anne was pregnant. And of course, we were very excited. I mean, I don't think, it didn't impinge upon me, perhaps the disappointment that John could not continue. They'd said, look, when you can take up this offer again. Anyway, Anne went into hospital, and I remember being very excited. You know, there haven't been any babies in our family for a long time. Anyway, I remember she went into hospital, and I still remember the next morning going in, and I was all excited, and I remember going into my mother and saying, what's happened? And my mother was grey, and she said the baby was stillborn. And I was shattered, you know, we all were. And so that was how it was. And I knew nothing about the reality of the situation.
For Jane, the painful reality of the situation would take some 10 years to unfold and be revealed.
In 1963, John learned of the newly formed SANROC, South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, and immediately he felt that he might be able to do valuable work there and bring about change in attitude among white South Africans.
With the banning by the regime of SANROC's founding director, Dennis Brutus, John Harris takes over the vice chairmanship from journalist and armed activist Hugh Lewin. Lobbying to get South Africa's whites-only participation banned from the upcoming 1964 Tokyo Olympic Games, John travels to Lucerne, Switzerland, and successfully addresses the International Olympic Committee. On his way home, John addresses press conferences in Rome and London. Back in South Africa, the NLC arm carry out 3 sabotage explosions on installations at Woodstock, Rosebank and Kenilworth stations, successfully disrupting the rail service between Cape Town and Simonstown.
We didn't take the youngsters forming the African resistance movement very seriously. We just thought a lot of silly buggers blowing up pylons and getting caught. We really didn't think it was very serious.
2 weeks later, arriving at the airport for his planned departure to represent SANROC at the upcoming International Olympic Committee meeting in Baden-Baden, John Harris is intercepted and his passport seized by the South African Security Police.
John was the friend who took over SANROC responsibilities from me. And in fact, it was John who was successful in getting the South African all-white Olympic team banned from the 1964 Tokyo Summer Olympics. And it was after that I recruited John into ARM.
Operating in cells on a strictly need-to-know basis, the recruitment by Hugh Lewin of John Harris into ARM happened unbeknown to Cape Town membership and was shared solely with fellow Johannesburg ARM member John Lloyd.
We didn't really know what Anne was thinking. She certainly did whatever John said. He was a very clever man. He was one of the quiz kids. She was a teacher herself. She was with John. But she was a serene and patient person. She was just the most extraordinarily nice person.
John felt terribly deeply about the situation in South Africa, and he felt passionately that he must fight for what he believed to be justice, and he gave his time and his energy and everything he had towards this.
Never a word of complaint, and that was Anne, throughout the trial also.
A month after John's recruitment, Nelson Mandela and 9 co-accused are charged, and the 26th of November marks the start of the Rivonia Trial at the Palace of Justice in Pretoria. 6 weeks later, come the new year, it's the final countdown to the 24th of July 1964, and events that will shake the foundations of South African society, as good intentions irrevocably, once more, pave the way to hell. On the 12th of February, John Harris is served a banning order by the apartheid regime. 8 weeks later, on the 20th of April, Nelson Mandela delivers his closing address from the dock.
I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Six weeks later, on the 10th of June 1964, a son, David, is born to Anne and John Harris. 2 days later, on the 12th of June 1964, sentence is passed at the conclusion of the Rivonia Trial. 8 of the 10 accused are pronounced guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. In response to the outcome of the Rivonia Trial, on the 18th of June 1964, the African resistance movement carry out a series of synchronized sabotage attacks on electricity pylons in both Cape Town and Johannesburg. This was to be the final sabotage act by ARM. The 4th of July 1964 marked a watershed in the existence of the African resistance movement. Unaware of events taking place in Cape Town, with special permission from the authorities under banning orders, John attends the wedding of his younger sister, Jane, to his best friend, Drew Archibald.
It was a very happy wedding. We were married in Florida, and my father had booked a restaurant in perhaps Rivonia or somewhere like that. We were not a very sociable family in that sense. It was the smallest wedding, I think. No, people have bigger weddings than this. We had my parents, Drew's mother, and his brother, and my uncle, and Drew and me, obviously, and John and Anne. John had to obtain special permission to come to the wedding, And after the wedding we talked, it was a bit of a, not so much a joke, but John handed round, showed us his letter from the minister giving him special permission to be at the wedding. Now, at no point then did I have any feeling that he had things on his mind, but then I had things on my mind, like I was getting married. Now remember, I've got a very nice photograph, a little black and white photograph of an Anne pushing the pram, and yeah, it was a happy occasion. Drew and I went away for a few days to the coast, to, I forget where it was, I think it was, well, the south coast anyway. We went away for about a week to somewhere like Ivongo or something like that for a few days.
As the Harris family celebrate in Johannesburg, the security police launch a countrywide swoop on all suspected left-wing activists. In Cape Town, National Union of South African Students President and Executive Member of ARM, Adrian Leftwich, is one of the first detained. Under interrogation, Leftwich breaks down and gives up the names of all fellow ARM members known to him. Anticipating detention, many high-profile members of ARM flee the country and go into exile. The remainder are steadily tracked down and detained by the security police.
They were nationwide swoops, and it wasn't just the ARM, it was everybody, such as the president of NUSAS, for instance, Adrian Leftwich. So he was picked up on the 4th of July, and then people were picked up, one after the other. People I knew had been involved. So I started panicking. You know, they were going to come for me. Something was clearly happening.
I was picked up with a lot of other people in 1964. There was a general roundup of anyone on the left. And what they were really looking for was rounding up the Communist Party. I wasn't a member of the Communist Party, but a number of the other people were. And I ended up under the 90-day laws, it was called, the General Laws Amendment Act of 1963, which meant that they could detain us for up to 90 days at a time without any access to anything. And so I ended up first in Pretoria Central with a group of people, then they transferred us all to Pretoria Local Prison.
Being a member, and he had recruited people into the organization, he felt it was his duty to warn them of the impending arrests and that they should flee. He had adequate time in which to flee, but he felt honor-bound and duty-bound to first get the other members out of harm's way, and especially those that he had recruited. And that unfortunately led to his being captured.
Knew nothing of John Harris. I knew of the Liberal Party, of course, of which he was a member, and of the African Resistance Movement, as it became to be called, who were not part of our group. Our group was the Congress of Democrats, which tended to be, as we later discovered, really a front for the Communist Party. And the other lot were the non-communist left. And I knew some of the people who were journalists, such as Hugh Lewin, for example, but I didn't know of John Harris at all.
For the first 3 weeks, I was being interrogated every day, several times a day. And I was, of course, isolated completely. I had no idea what was going on in the world. And I had, nothing to read in detention. So, that in itself is pretty unpleasant, especially if you're young and naive, which I was. I was 23, something like that, and very naive.
When he was arrested, taken into an interrogation room, stripped naked, he was made to stand on 2 telephone directories, and he stood on there without sleep for 2 days while being interrogated, beaten with a phone book, not fed, not allowed to go to the toilet, tried to get him to break, to get names. He was strong enough not to crack.
I was taken on a Saturday out of my cell, and he told me to stand, and I stood. Again, it was early days in detention, so the whole idea that you could be made to stand for 5 days hadn't reached me yet. I mean, there were lots of things we simply didn't know about, we weren't prepared for. So I stood up, I thought, no problem. And that went on right through the day. At one stage, I wanted to go to the toilet, and they all came with me, and they left the door open, and I went to the toilet. So this was a bit unusual, but I stood through the day, from the morning through the day and into the early hours of the next day. And by this stage, I had walked in on an interrogation going on with Adrian Leftwich, and he said to me, "There's nothing you can tell them that'll be new to them. They know everything."
It was in Compol, the headquarters of the police. They tell you, always on a Friday, we're coming for you on the Monday, which gives you enough time to develop a severe case of diarrhea. Well, in my case, certainly, of worry. But they drive you down in handcuffs, and you go into Compol, and again, old corridors, dusty old files and things. The room was simply a bare room, the radiator on one side. I'll never forget that. There was a coat hanger, one of those standard old ones, you know, and a desk with a chair behind it where sat the person who was the main interrogator, Van Sale in my case. And that was in a completely bare room. And he walked around, Van Sale, and he drew a chalk square around my feet, and he said, "I deem that square fit to be your place of detention," which meant, theoretically, they could go to court and swear on the Bible that I tried to escape from detention had I stepped outside the square. So I didn't understand the thing called statue torture. And they stand there and they make jokes. "You can't even stand." And I said, "I can stand for a long time." And Van Sale said, "We've got a long time." And it's only after 12 or 14 or 15, you suddenly begin to realize, oh my God, my legs. And after 36 and a quarter hours, you begin to realize, and every one of the people who are interrogated in Compol will tell you the time to a quarter hour, because there was a church clock outside that chimed every quarter hour. And so you knew. And then they used things like, Blanche came to me and said, "Look, you see that coat hanger thing?" He said, "You know, when Luxmart was here, Luxmart Silwane, who was found hanged in his cell," he said, "I gave him the wire to hang himself."
I think that the whole situation in Cape Town had erupted. And in fact, while Drew and I were down the south coast, I remember very vividly going to the desk. We were staying in a hotel, going to the desk, and at the reception centre there were newspapers. And the whole thing, and Adrian Leftwich had given up everybody, and etc. You know, Adrian gave up Hugh, who was his best friend. And Hugh had initially approached John to become a member of the ARM. So it was only John, my brother, John Lloyd, and Hugh who were left on the scene in Johannesburg. Hugh was then taken. And John Lloyd, who was only about 22, I think, and my brother were left. And I think that what happened was that he spoke to John Lloyd, "What can we do to bring these people to their senses?" And I think that John Lloyd said, "No, we shouldn't do this because people will be hurt." And John said, "We will give warnings." Then John Lloyd was arrested. And I think that added even more to John's determination to take some sort of stand to indicate that the system had, that white people, that the government had to be jolted into awareness that this could not go on.
There I was that last morning before my detention, telling him it's all over, it's finished, there's nothing more to do. And in fact, I also told him where we had stored the dynamite. Now I was, as he saw it, I think, handing over the baton, but saying, "Sit tight, do nothing." From John's point of view, why stop now? He'd never stopped before. So it was John's chance to show his mettle, and this wasn't just an opportunity to him, but a duty. It was precisely what he wanted. We gave him the baton, but with no suggestion to do anything, but equally no suggestion not to do anything. the truth is that I should have known that John would not do nothing.
Very obviously, in the African resistance movement, he would go around saying to people, if you can kill one person and save one person's life, would you do it? If you could kill one person and you'd save 100 people's life, would you do it? What about one person and 1,000? He was telling us all what he was doing.
And when we came back, we had a flat belonging to a colleague, and they were away, and so we stayed there for a few weeks in Hillbrow. And I was in a car with John, and John saying that something was going to happen. I don't know how specific he was. I can't remember. But saying they wanted to stall things. And again, you don't really want to know too much. This was my brother. We had the same views. And living at that time, everything was... There was almost a feeling of unreality about living in South Africa at that time. It wasn't unreality so much as it was almost as if you were on a slippery dip and you sort of couldn't get off. And I had no idea that John was involved in any of this. And when he put this into the context as well, Drew and I were married on the 4th of July. So I was just been married. It was my first year of teaching. So therefore, I had also my own life, very much so. And I'm sure he must have said, I'm going to plant a bomb. I don't think I said anything about it because what was there to say?
Having placed the bomb on the whites-only platform of Johannesburg Station in order to prevent loss of life and injury to commuters, John Harris made 3 warning phone calls from the Jeppe Street Post Office. And so, in the late afternoon on the 24th of July 1964, the Railway Police and 2 newspapers, the Rand Daily Mail and Die Transvaal, received a short message by phone. The message given to each was much the same. Listen carefully. This is a very important message. This is the African resistance movement. Can you hear me? There is a time bomb somewhere in the main concourse of the Johannesburg station. On the handle of the suitcase is a note bearing the words, "Back in 10 minutes. It will go off at 4:33. Don't touch it. It is not our intention to harm anyone. Clear the concourse by using the public address system at once."
I was in the flat and I knew that this was, John had arranged, had organised to do this that afternoon. I think it was a Friday, you can correct me on this. I think it was a Friday or a Saturday. And I knew this was going to take place. And somehow I just hoped that it wouldn't take place. And I remember feeling very, very anxious about it. And just when you think that something awful is going to happen, and it's like, as I said, it's a bit like being on a roller coaster, you can't stop it, And I was so anxious and nervous because Drew would have been at work, and I was just sitting there in absolute angst. I didn't know what to do. I'm just waiting for news. Very silly thing to do. I walked down to Johannesburg Station, which was an extremely stupid thing to do. And as I say, I walked down, I think it was probably about 2 o'clock. And then I walked back realising that this had been an extremely stupid thing to do.
Having made 3 warning phone calls, John Harris felt elated. Believing his plan perfectly executed, in a euphoric state of mind, John drove home to share an evening of domestic bliss with Anne and 6-week-old baby David. But, unbeknown to John, despite his warning phone calls, no action was taken by the authorities to trace the suitcase or to clear the concourse of the rush hour crowd.
At 4:33 p.m. precisely, it exploded with hideous effect under the whites-only bench in the shelter at the top of the stairs leading to platforms 5 and 6. At least 23 commuters were badly injured. They included a 12-year-old, Glynis, who was permanently disfigured, and her 77-year-old grandmother, who died of her injuries 6 weeks later.
Then they took me upstairs to where I was interrogated, took me upstairs always with a group of men around me, taking me up there. And they stuck a Sunday Times, it might have been a Sunday, they stuck a Sunday Times into my face and said, "This is what you people have been doing. What do you see?" or something like that. And I had no idea what it was all about. At first I pointed to a photograph of Forster, who was then Minister of Justice, sitting watching a rugby match. And that infuriated. I said, well, there's Forster sitting. The anger rose. They got furious and then showed me a picture of the station bomb, basically. And again, and then I learned a little bit about this station bomb. Following that, Rousseau was sitting there, and then my usual interrogator, Speaker van Wyk, who was already fairly notorious in Cape Town. He walked in and he said to Rousseau in Afrikaans, please leave me alone with her. At some point, Rousseau, before Van Wyk came in, had opened the door of the interrogation room. It was shut, and he opened it and he said to me, "Do you know why I'm opening this door?" And I said, well, it's quite stuffy in here. It was a storeroom. It's quite stuffy in here, but clearly there was a sexual innuendo which I just failed to pick up. Clearly he was aware what Speaker was implying. Got up, walked out. I was still standing. I had long hair then, longer than now, and he grabbed me by my hair, pulled me down to the floor, beat my head on the floor, which was wood, beat my head until I was unconscious and lying on the floor. As I came round, I don't think I was unconscious for long, but of course I don't. By the time I came round, the first thing I saw was a bunch of my hair under the table, and the lots of trouser legs and feet. So there were lots of security police in there by now. And I sort of came up onto my knees, and Van Wyk said, don't act up, don't pretend. And I was retching. Yeah, that's what upset him. Anyway, eventually I was at the table, and they tried to get me to, put paper, and I was completely incoherent. So there was no statement that was coming out because I was incoherent. So they took me down to the cells, which was by then very much halfway through the early morning. And Van Wyk said, "I'll come back at 5 o'clock. And I was absolutely terrified. I mean, I hadn't known what terror meant until then, waiting for him to come back. And I just lay curled up on the mat that I had in the cell.
At different times, particularly in the evenings or early at night, they would bring back prisoners from interrogation and used to do a grand show of it, dragging people, etc. It was generally to frighten those who were still to be interrogated. And I heard the clanging of the gates again, which meant someone was coming in. And I heard this moaning, which was fairly standard for people who were being brought in, sometimes did moan, and someone was dragged in, and 2 cells down, locked up. So I waited, as we all did, and then they locked the various gates. You could hear them as the warders went out, the clang, clang. And once they'd gone, I got up onto my toilet bucket, which one used, and a stool, to get to the grill which led into the passageway. And I whispered down to whoever was there, and that's how I met John Harris. He told me his name was John Harris. He had difficulty speaking. He told me that his jaw was broken. As it turned out, it was broken in 3 places. And he told me what had happened, and that he'd placed a bomb on the station, but he said in the main concourse. And this is something I never forgot. What John said very simply was that he had placed a bomb in order to show that there was still resistance to the regime in the middle of the concourse. But someone, he said, must have moved the bomb, and he was convinced that the police had done it, I think from when I recall that conversation, towards a bench, because of course an elderly woman was killed and her granddaughter badly burned. He said, I didn't intend anyone to get hurt, and I had warned them. It would make sense to me that they decided to let it go, because the government was under an incredible amount of pressure at the time, and they wanted to prove that they were dealing with absolutely merciless terrorists or whatever, and this would have played right into their hands, and in particular the fact of the death and the injury. I was also aware that the railway police actually had a direct line to Hendrik van der Berg, the head of the Bureau of State Security, so they would obviously have communicated with one another. In any event, John was then arrested. John was horribly treated. He had his jaw broken, etc. And he said to me, look, it's very painful, I can't talk. It was a very brief conversation. It's a conversation that's lived with me all my life. I've written about it several times over the years because it's something that haunts me. And that was the first, last and only time I ever had anything to do with John Harris.
Could we really say that we were not involved with the bomb at the station? And what would I have done if it had been me and not John left alone outside with the rest of our group either detained or gone? I hope that I would have had the strength to oppose the idea if anyone had suggested it. But there is something I can't deny. Before I was detained, I gave John the information he needed to continue our activities.
I think we heard almost immediately that John had been picked up. And the Hain family immediately got in their combi and came to Rudaport and picked up Anne and the baby and took them to live with them in Pretoria. And it was terribly brave of them because they were being attacked for being liberals anyway. They'd had bombs on their roof and that kind of rough stuff, pretty scary. So it was very brave of them, because after that a lot of people didn't want to have anything to do with the liberals, let alone John. Then Ernie got a phone call from John Harris saying, please come and see me. He'd been badly beaten up by then. And Ernie said to me, he just couldn't, he was too ill and he was too frightened and he just couldn't do it. But next morning he woke up and thought he simply had to go and see him. So he never got to hospital. He did go to see John, he and Ruth Hayman. And John was, his jaw had been broken, it had been wired up. His balls were black because of torture. And he said to Ernie, please, Ernie, don't let them hang me. And he asked Ernie, please, to defend him. And Ernie was too emotionally involved. He said, I can't do it. He was actually furious with John. But he did stand by him. And he had to spend the next 2 weeks with Ruth Hayman going up and down the bar trying to get someone to agree to defend him, and people were reluctant. But eventually, Naomi Phillips agreed to do so, and so did David Soggett. People were frightened to be associated with John in any way. But Ernie went to see him often and stood by him when he got the death penalty.
John Harris, the friend and fellow undergraduate whom I'd persuaded to join our sabotage group. Nothing could have defined more clearly the desperation of the time. Such a lonely act. And what would I have done if it had been me and not John left alone outside with the rest of our group either detained or gone? I hope that I would have had the strength to oppose the idea if anyone had suggested it.
After John was arrested, my father kept saying to the people he was working with, this is all a terrible mistake and they'll let him out and it'll, it'll all blow over and it's awful, but it'll all be okay. I think that my mother caught on pretty quickly. I now strongly suspect that my mother realised it wasn't a horrible mistake on the part of the government and that this was not going to have a happy ending.
With the death of Ethel Rees on the 19th of August, the chances of a happy outcome for John took a turn for the worse. Meanwhile, 3 separate trials of 12 more armed members, including Hugh Lewin, the friend who recruited John into arm, were underway. On trial in Cape Town, Stephanie Kemp appeared as accused number 5, with Eddie Daniels accused number 1.
At the time when they were arrested, they knew they were facing treason charges. But when John Harris let the bomb off on the station, they were told they were then facing the death sentence. And then they were very fearful because they didn't know if that was the end of the road.
I didn't know Eddie. The organisation operated very much on a need-to-know basis, so only those people that you worked with that you actually know. But he was accused number 1 when we were brought to trial. Out of 5 accused, I was accused number 5. Our lawyers negotiated with the state to allow us to plead guilty to the Suppression of Communism Act, and then that immediately took the sentence down from a death sentence to 10 years maximum. So the likelihood that we'd get much less than that. And Eddie wasn't given that opportunity.
As the shadow of possible death sentences loomed darker, pressure on armed members to turn state witness increased. Ex-NUSAS president and executive member of ARM, Adrian Leftwich, had already given up the names of all fellow activists, and turning state witness went on to give damning evidence which led to the conviction of close friends and fellow members of ARM, many of whom he himself had recruited into the organization. In contrast, Eddie Daniels, offered freedom in exchange for testimony, steadfastly refused.
At the time when he was arrested, there was a lot of pressure on him to give up a name, but my dad lived by his convictions and nothing would change that. If he believed that was so, doesn't matter what, he will not break away from that. He'll stick to it irrespective of how easy or difficult that path is going to be. That's just the way he was.
Stephanie Kemp was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment with 3 suspended. Hugh Lewin, 7 years, and Eddie Daniels, the heaviest sentence of 15 years imprisonment.
What he said was because of the hype at the time of Robben Island, Devil's Island, the stories coming from the island of the brutality and the way prisoners are treated, he just felt that he'll never come back. Once he was sentenced 15 years on Robben Island, he thought, that's it, that's the end, I'm gone. One of the favorite memories that he always recounts is getting to the island, and the first person who introduced himself to him was Mr. Mandela. And they formed a very good, strong friendship on the island. And Mr. Mandela always included him in their discussions. He wasn't an ANC member, but he always referred to him as the representative then of the Liberal parties, but they always included him.
On the 14th of September 1964, charged with murder, John Harris went on trial at the Palace of Justice in Pretoria.
John was not seen for a long time because of the way that he had been handled, and he had to receive help and attention before he could be brought to court. We hoped against hope that things would not turn out as they did, but we didn't know. And I think one of the things that is very, very moving, and I found this rereading some of John's letters to us, was that a thread that ran through his letters, especially to me, because I used to write 3 and 4 times a week, was his anxiety that my parents would be okay. He was very, very anxious about them. I was working at Marist Brothers College and Observatory, and I took the day off and I went over to Pretoria, and I remember getting there and they said, oh, you can't come in, it's full or something in the court. And I said who I was, and so of course they let me in. And that, I do remember, I think that was the only time that I actually had physical contact with John. And at the lunch break, at the recess in the court, I remember I was able to go down in the court where John was held. And it wasn't a cell, it was a room down below in the court. And I was able to talk to him and give him a hug, and you know. But that was the only time that I actually physically saw him and touched him, and you know.
Come October, white South Africa fumes in self-righteous indignation at the banning of their all-white teams from participation at the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. A significant setback for the apartheid regime. For John Harris, fighting for his life, validation and confirmation of his vision that one day there may indeed come to be a non-racial South Africa. As with Adrian Leftwich in the Cape Town and Pretoria trials, it was John Lloyd who gave the damning evidence against John Harris that effectively sealed his fate. On the 6th of November 1964, John Harris was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by Justice Ludorf.
Well, at that particular moment in time, I happened to be the only white woman political prisoner. So initially, all the white women serving long-term criminal sentences were kept in Kroonstad prisons. A handful had been sentenced to death for murder of one sort or another, and then that had been commuted. So at least 2 of them had spent time in the death cell in Pretoria, the death cell for white women prisoners. So these women used to talk very graphically about the cell, about how the walls were black, but they were marked by blood. So, you know, I heard these stories. Then they drove me back to Pretoria, and they put me in a cell. The first couple of nights I had nightmares, and the one nightmare was about a dead body lying next to me in this little bunk. And then hit me that what I recognized was this death cell from the descriptions from these women in Kroonstad.
My father and Anne went to Cape Town to plead. To the 23rd of March was the last letter I got from John, and he said, it doesn't look good.
I learned that our plea for mercy had failed and that John was to die when I went to visit him on Monday afternoon. I couldn't speak. John was very worried about me, and he had by then, of course, been told that he was to die on Thursday. He appeared unconcerned about himself, and his only thought was to comfort me. On Wednesday morning, the day before the execution, I saw John for 90 minutes. I was with him again for 2 hours in the afternoon. I took our son David just to see him. He played happily with the screen and crawled around on the prison floor. How can I describe the moment when the last visit was up and it was time to leave?
One of the few friends that stuck by him, Ernie Wenzel, supported John Harris throughout his trial and was with him on death row the day before his execution.
He was very calm and very brave. He said that Father McGuinness had said he would be there with him and would pray for him, but that he remained an atheist. He's very grateful for Father McGuinness's help. I don't think Ernie spoke to me much about what they said. He was pretty shattered. And we vigiled the night he was executed, and it was just terrible to leave Johannesburg. As John's father said it, we all left Johannesburg while he was alive in order to attend his funeral next day.
That night, the night before his hanging, they were singing all night. The singing went on, men and women, throughout the night. And I still remember God Be With You Till We Meet Again being sung all through the night. And these beautiful, harmonies, and just beautiful.
And we vigiled with Father McGuinness that night. And then in the morning he said a prayer and he went off to John's execution.
He always said he was an atheist, of course. But Father McGuinness and he were very good friends. Father McGuinness walked with him to his execution. These are my personal letters from Father McGuinness, because he wrote to me every week. Dear Sister Catherine, at 5 a.m. I went up to the jail, and John was in quite a good mood, not at all frightened or depressed. We were surrounded by warders, and again he mentioned this matter of forgiveness, and told me that he had no hard feelings or bitterness. Just then, one of the warders came in to say goodbye to him, and John shook hands with him. Then the executioner came, and John shook hands with him and the other warders, and last of all with me. And then he went to his death singing, "We Shall Overcome."
And then very early in the morning, about 5, a very young wardress, well under 20 years old, came to my peephole in my door and said, "John Harris has just been hanged."
It was horrible. We were all hated the death penalty as it was. But to have your friend executed was pretty awful.
John Harris, the final spear carrier of the African resistance movement, died alone. The rest of us, I suppose, were lucky in that we survived.
I am told that John died without bitterness. He died deeply regretting the harm that had come to the innocent victims of his act. He died forgiving the treatment meted out to him while he was detained. He held no malice towards his former friends and colleagues who gave evidence against him when they appeared as state witnesses in the case. Peter, the 15-year-old son of the Haynes with who I have been staying, also read a Bible verse from Ecclesiastes. In his address, Peter said, "We are gathered here today out of respect for John, whom we all knew with love and affection. Though John is gone from us, he will live on in our thoughts and our memories, for the knowledge of him, of his presence, will remain always with those who knew him. John will live on also in his son David, for to know David is to see his father looking out again through his son's eyes at a new and wonderful world."
The saddest thing about John Harris and the station bomb is that in any other time and in most other places, John would probably have been found guilty of manslaughter. But not so John in July 1964. He was never going to beat the rope. They wanted him, you see, as a prize exhibit to beat into submission anyone opposing the great apartheid dream. They wanted John dead.
The regime was under extraordinary international pressure because they'd suddenly brought in, after 1963, in the first place you'd had Sharpeville. They'd reacted to Sharpeville by banning the major multiracial and non-racial people opposing apartheid in a non-violent way. They banned them. And then, of course, there was an armed struggle. The government then reacted again with even further repression. And the 1963 General Laws Amendment Act, which brought in detention without trial, etc., there was extraordinary diplomatic pressure building. And they felt they had to do something. So what they wanted to do was portray not only that they were tough on law and order, but also that they faced people who were indiscriminate killers of innocent people. They were not. They were targeting the communist tyranny, the communist evil, these evil people who would do anything. They portrayed, Van der Berg at one stage referred to John as a communist. Complete nonsense. I think they saw the international image had to be of the bulwark against this evil international communist threat. And John provided them with the excuse. And John had to die. John was just useful for their cause as they saw it, which was par for the course, I'm afraid.
Looking back, it was an absolute revelation as to how the attachment to John was. I don't know whether there's, is there a special relationship between a son and a mother? Who knows? But as I say, my mother committed suicide.
On Robben Island, with the news of John's death, Eddie Daniels and fellow inmates stand a moment's silence, followed by Nelson Mandela's brief tribute. Here is a white man who died fighting apartheid.
We have also received threatening and abusive calls. The last call before John died, it came through late on Wednesday night. It was from an anonymous caller who told Adeline Hayne, "I hope you hang with Harris." The first we had in the morning was from another anonymous caller who said to her, "You are next on the list." But these are things I shall forget. There is so very much I shall remember.
At the time of John Harris's execution, David was 10 months old. During the trial, Ad and Walter Hayne opened their home to Anne and baby David and took care of them. After the execution, Ad and Walter, banned by the system, were constantly harassed by the security police. Anne Harris suffered the same treatment, and there was no immediate future for any of them in South Africa. Ad and Walter Hayne emigrated with 15-year-old son Peter and his 3 siblings to the UK. Anne got a teaching post in Uganda, and she and David moved to Uganda.
No, I had a very happy childhood. No particular trauma associated with that. Obviously, as I grew to know more when I was a teenager and so on, got more interested in it, found out more, that has its own, not traumas, but its own challenges, intellectual, emotional, whatever it may be. I suppose in one sense I wasn't conscious of growing up as John Harris's son in that kind of sort of symbolic kind of way. I was just who I was growing up in the situation in which I found myself. It was a sort of background feature of my life, but I don't think any more of a background feature than it would be for anybody who hadn't seen their father since they were a baby and was growing up in a different country. I think that's a big testament to the way my mother decided to get on with life, and so we've got on with life. She's not moved on in the sense by any means of forgetting it, because she hasn't forgotten it, but I know she would say that she very much made a conscious decision not to spend her life living as, sort of quotes, John Harris's widow.
After 2 very happy years in Uganda, Anne Harris with toddler David moved back to the UK and settled in London. In London, Anne meets and marries Martin Wolfe, who formally adopts David. Happily remarried, Anne and Martin have a son of their own, Toby. The year is 1969, and the London-based anti-apartheid campaign against South Africa's participation in international sport reaches a climax, with massive demonstrations against the Springbok rugby tour of the British Isles.
Springbok rugby had recovered its fighting spirit, but sporting doors were closing for South Africa, and in 1968 the country was again barred from the Olympic Games, this time in Mexico City. Peter Hayne, Dennis Brutus and other luminaries of the anti-apartheid movement were making their presence felt, despite progress on the home front. Anti-apartheid activist Peter Hayne made it clear that the sport boycott would continue until the Pretoria regime was either ousted or replaced by a non-racial government.
Spearheaded by Peter Hayne, inadvertently fulfilling John Harris's Sandrock legacy, the demonstrations effectively disrupt and cripple the tour and successfully initiate the international sports boycott and ban of apartheid South Africa's international sports participation.
So we then decided that we wanted to spend Christmas with Anne. So we arranged for her to come to South Africa. And Drew had an aunt who had a little shack on the north coast in Natal. It was wonderful. It was a shack, a real shack. But we were about 50 meters from the sea. And I remember one afternoon my father was lying down and Anne and I were cutting up vegetables for a meal. And in spite of the fact that, you know, we've always been very close and so on, and Anne just said to me, apropos of nothing, she said, do you remember about the baby that was stillborn? And I said, yes. And she said, well, do you know anything else or something like that? And I said, no. I mean, you know, that had happened. And she said, well, the baby wasn't stillborn. And I was so stunned, I didn't know what to say. I didn't ask one question. I didn't know what to say. Apparently, she was adopted. She was at Cotland's Baby Sanctuary, and she was adopted. And John was very anxious that she be adopted by a Jewish family because he felt that they treated their children very lovingly and brought children up well.
In 1961, a Jewish couple from Brakpan, Jenny and Barney Ballin, had lost their only son, Harold, 5 years old at the time, to leukemia. Grieving their loss, they were delighted when a member of the Brakpan Jewish community, whose brother was a doctor, informed them that he had just delivered a baby to a couple in Johannesburg who were giving the child up for adoption. Since then, unbeknown to Anne, John, or anyone else, the baby girl, named Lynn, was happily growing up as the daughter of Jenny and Barney Ballin in Brakpan.
I was incredibly lucky to have them. They were very loving parents. I used to say my dad loved me like a beam of light. It was sort of unconditional, and he just thought I was wonderful no matter what I did. And my mom was more complicated. She wanted me to have everything that she'd never had. So it was, you know, all of the dance classes and the speech and drama and the sports teams and all of this. And then, you know, she also got me a scholarship to go to a private high school. So there was a lot of that, but at the same time, she wanted the best for me. But yeah, I felt very deeply loved and wanted. Mom and Dad were part of the Jewish community, and I went to the Jewish nursery school, which I have very happy memories of.
I then grew up, initially completely ignorant of all this. When I was about 14, I discovered that I'd got this sister. No way of contacting, knowing anything about it, but just knowing that she existed.
And then I went to Wits. I ended up doing a degree in English literature with what we called sub-majors in drama and film and psychology. And then I went to the Wits Business School and did like a 1-year postgraduate there because I felt like I should have something useful. My university boyfriend's family had already immigrated to Los Angeles, and at the time all young white men had to go to the army, and we were both very politically opposed to what the army represented. Young white conscripts were also being sent into the townships, not just to the border, to suppress any resistance that was happening in the townships. And that was sort of the moment of a question, whether to get married and leave. So we basically left South Africa 4 months after we graduated. It was very hard for my dad because, he and I were so close. And when I was at university, I used to phone them every night, at 6 o'clock every single night, no matter where I was, I would phone them. And so After my mom died, I was there in South Africa spending time with my dad, and we were trying to sort of put all of her affairs in order, and we were looking for her will. And I found my adoption papers. And at that point, I was, I think 28 years old, and no one had ever told me I was adopted. And then about a year later, heard that South Africa had opened up the adoption laws. So they were allowing people to access their adoption records. And all they found were just the initials, basically. So we had, F.J. Harris and C.A. Harris and a last known address. And then my mom-in-law at the time, she said, there was a John Harris who bombed Johannesburg Station. And I said, no, it can't be. That's, too extreme of a possibility.
I tried, but unsuccessfully when I was about 17 to trace her, but of course with documents being confidential and all the rest of it, there was no way I was going to make any progress with that. And of course that was still the apartheid times.
I sort of put that aside, and then I went back to South Africa. My dad was ill, and I went through my school prize books, actually, from primary school, when I won prizes. And one of them was called A Newspaper History of South Africa. And there was an article in there about the Park Station bombing. And in the article were their full names. So it actually said Frederick John Harris and his wife Anne. And I thought, wait a minute, these initials do actually match up. And the town that they lived in was listed on my adoption papers as 12 Rose Street, Florida. And I thought, wait a second, this is too much of a coincidence. And then by a sort of lucky series of breaks, really, she found somebody who found somebody who found somebody who found somebody, and eventually the message got back to us. There's this woman who says that she might be Anne's daughter. Is that possible? Hugh Lewin was in Zimbabwe at the time. He got my letter and said he had spoken to Ad Hain, and Ad had put him in touch with Anne, and they are all delighted. And it was sort of, to unpack those words was it meant it was a whole family, and that they're delighted meant that they would welcome me being in touch with them and reconnecting with them. So we arranged to meet her. My mum and stepfather were living in Switzerland at the time. So in December of 1989, while the Berlin Wall was coming down, I went to family Christmas in Switzerland, and Lynn came from Los Angeles to Switzerland, and we met her in Zurich. The reunion was really wonderful. I arrived at the airport in Zurich, and she had sent me photos, so I knew what they looked like. And there they were all standing on the other side of the window, and my mother was holding up a little sign that said Lynn. And yes, it was very emotional and a little bit unbelievable. I think the first question I asked her was, can you tell me why you gave me up for adoption? And she said that it was really that that they were very young, and he was not ready for the responsibility of a family, and so it was John's choice, and that she went along with it. So then I asked them why they hadn't given David up for adoption, and she said that it had been so painful. She hadn't known how painful it would be to do that, and she just remembered sitting in my grandmother's garden, John's mother's garden, and feeling very numb, and because they thought that she had given birth to a stillborn child, and so that's what the grief was.
Meanwhile, a year later, 1990, with the release of Nelson Mandela, democracy is seen to be coming to South Africa.
Mandela being released obviously was a fantastic event. For me, the thing that was most sort of personal, though, was the first elections, because I really felt this is what John died for. It's seeing the queues of people queuing up to vote. Then you knew it was sort of irreversible. And I know that John was fiercely anti-communist. His focus and the focus of the people around him, I think, was very much on apartheid as a racial issue, and they were looking for a non-racial South Africa. And once everybody had the vote, in a sense, that was sorted.
In April 2005, John Harris's widow, Anne, together with children Lynn and David, as well as other members of the family, fly to South Africa to attend a special service commemorating John Harris at Freedom Park outside Pretoria. At the service, John Harris's name is officially added to the Roll of Honour commemorating the 132 executed for fighting apartheid.
As John's sister, I feel very proud to be part of his family.
And I can't forget the loss of those people injured and the woman who died in the station bombing when the security police chose to not evacuate. All those deaths were such a waste, such a loss for the country, including many of you, for what he and all of you gave to help bring about this change and hope in South Africa that can be the basis for all that is still to come. Thank you.
We see this as very much representing all the people who contributed to the struggle in South Africa, not just the people who died, whether executed like my father was or dying in the course of the struggle, but also all those people who suffered in many, many ways over many, many years to bring about the new South Africa. This is not just about my father, it's about all of them.
It was an incredibly moving and emotional situation. It was a symbol of a recognition of the contribution made by someone like John Harris. And that was very important. Very few of those who were not part of the mainstream, including someone like Mahlangu were often not recognized until very much later.
The Order of Luthuli was for his contribution to the upliftment of South Africa and its people. But again, he's a modest man, so he always was, and very humble. It wasn't something he'd run around and show everybody, but he was very proud of it. It had a place of honor in his home, and now it's got a place of honor in mine.
I'm very conscious there were thousands of other people who were either executed by the South African state extrajudicially, or who simply died in the course of Sharpeville or Soweto or whatever it might be, some of whom have been recognised in other ways, some of whom will never be known specifically and not have that formal recognition.
The whole notion of hanging is so ghastly. I mean, people were hanged sometimes, a lot of people at one time, 7 at one time. So hanging had become something that you lived with in a political situation. When you think back of it, it seems unbelievable that these things were done. And just what courage it took to be in the struggle at all, to take on this strongest state in the whole continent, a state that soon afterwards was declared a crime against humanity by the United Nations in 1973. People normally aren't expected to make the kind of choices that we made. In a normal life, you're not expected to decide whether to take on apartheid, whether to go to prison, whether to keep your mouth shut. These are abnormal situations. And so when I look back now at even people doing small things, but certainly somebody like John Harris, I just think, wow, it must have taken so much courage to do something so drastic as he did.
Yes, I am. I'm not proud of the consequences of what he did, obviously, but well-intentioned things sometimes have terrible consequences. So at that level, I'm proud of him, yeah.
After the Freedom Park ceremony, the family move across to the Rebecca Street West Cemetery to fulfill John's final request made before he died.
They refused to give the ashes to my sister or his family. My sister, they refused absolutely. So that all those years my sister didn't know, or Jane, John's sister, or his mother, poor Mrs. Harris, or his dad. they didn't know where he'd been buried, or if he'd been buried at all, or if his ashes had been discarded. We didn't know that. Eventually, in 1998, it's quite a long story, but I tracked down the reverend who was associated with prison services. He remembered Father McGuinness well, regarding him as a friend. In 1971, he was asked to bury John's ashes, which had been kept in the prison offices. The commander felt that respect for the dead was long overdue. And eventually I found a gardener and I asked him. And so there it was in the ground. And I thought it was much nicer than the pigeonholes along the wall. And so the stone, when I found it, just said John Harris and the date of his death. Did it say the date of his death? I can't remember. Just his name. And I thought the family would want to take up the ashes and make a memorial. But they didn't want to. Their concern was just his final request. That one day, in a new South Africa, on his memorial stone would be written, John Harris, true patriot,